All right, hello and welcome. I want to talk about stat allocation for your EVs, how to build them out, what stats matter the most. So for my beam EV, my buff beam EV, essentially, I've heavily prioritized power. I think that makes the most sense to prioritize. The other stats that if you increase them, it does affect the way that the buff beam buffs the towers and the defenses that are on the buff beam, but power scales so much better than the other stats. Fortify kind of doesn't matter. It's bonus armor, and why would you need that on your towers if they're not going to get hit? Your towers shouldn't be getting hit anyway, so I would say Fortify is the lowest priority in terms of stats, but range and defense rate scale so much worse than power. So I'll show you what I mean here. I've got a buff beam down here. It's got, let's just take a look here, 23.66% bonus attack rate. Now, if I go in and just dump, I'm at about 2,000 right now. If I go in and dump 500 points into defense rate, it goes up to 24.3. So 24.3, let's pull the points back out, 24.3, 23.6. It's less than 1% for 500 points. It's kind of significant. It doesn't scale that well. The same thing, range scales even worse. So let's add 500 points to range. I'm at 13.25 now. I'll add 500 points. And just as a reference, I'm at about 2,000 for that as well. So 13.25 at 500 points. And what do we get? 13.42. So it's a pretty lackluster change. So, but just as a reference, power scaling so much better. I'm at 50.61% right now. I'll pull out 500 points, and I'm at 4,300 as it is. So stats tend to scale worse the higher they get. I'm at well over double what I was for range and rate. Just as a reference, 50.61 right now. Let's add 500 points to that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I go up to 51.97. It's considerably better in terms of scaling. Even this high up, you're just getting more out of the stat. That said, you don't get a whole lot to begin with in the first place. The big increases in the percentage bonuses that you get here are going to be from if you level the beam up. So I've got, this just as a reference point, this is the shortest beam you can get for 4DU. This is the longest beam you can get for 6DU, and I just wanted to show that there is no change with the longer the beam. The longer the beam doesn't make it so that it buffs more. The buff percentage doesn't change with the size of the beam. But if we were to level up this beam here and then look again, it's a substantial difference. We get 50% more for a maxed out beam than we would for a level 1 beam. So, adding points to your stats does affect how good the beams are, but the biggest thing that's going to affect how good the buff beams are is going to be actually leveling them up on the field, and that's why, generally speaking, in terms of upgrade priority, the buff beams are the absolute top. In all of my builds so far where I have buff beams, they are the first thing that I max out. So another interesting thing with the buff beam is that, I thought this was odd. Here's the longest you can get for 4DU. Here's the longest you can get for 5DU. And then here's the longest you can get for 6DU. It's way, way longer. I think that's kind of strange. I kind of wish the 5DU beam was longer, but I thought that was an interesting tidbit. 4, 5, and 6DU respectively. That is a very odd way to scale the DU investment for the power for the buff beams, but that's the way it looks right now. So 5 going to be the worst value, 6 obviously going to be the best. Hard to imagine needing a buff beam that long, but I'm sure we'll find builds where they need a longer buff beam than that, hopefully, potentially. But yeah, that's what you get per DU for the buff beams. Continuing with the size comparison, here we've got the investment for 2, 3, 4, and 5 DU for the physical walls. This is what you get for 2DU. It's respectable. That's pretty good size. It's actually bigger than the Squire wall. And then 3DU, even longer. That's pretty useful. I do use this in an upcoming video. Maybe it's out yet. I'm not sure which I'm going to release first, but I use 3DU walls pretty effectively. Here's 4DUs, 4DU wall here, and 5DU is significant. It's a very big wall, but that's the size comparison for 2, 3, 4, and 5DU. That makes more sense to me in terms of the way the DU investment scales. Over here, I just have a size comparison for the rest of her defenses. The proton beam, its physical damage, there's the longest one you can get for 2DU, and then 3, 4, and 5. They can get pretty long. I'm not sure how I'm going to use these yet. They're physical damage. I mean, if I want physical damage in my lanes, I'm probably going to build an explosive trap. It's just more convenient, it's bigger, it's more useful overall, but maybe we'll find a use for these. Back in DD1, what we used to do with these is if we use them, draw a little X in the lane, and everything is going to get hit by 1 or 2 of these beams. The range on them is not fantastic. Things can be pretty close to the beam and still not being hit by it, but it remains to be seen how useful they'll be. Here's the reflect wall comparison: 2, 3, and 4 DU. So here, or I'm sorry, 1, 2, and 3 DU. Here's what you get for 1 DU. This is awesome. I love that we have something else to do with 1 DU now. And you get a pretty big wall here for 1 DU. This scales more reasonably as well. Here's 2 DU and 3 DU, the longest reflect field that you can get for 3 DU right there. Now, what I have highest hopes for in terms of how useful it'll be are these shock beams. Now, we did not yet have a form of crowd control that was electricity, so that was lightning. This is nice. We have poison gas traps, and the ensnares are poison based, and rage auras are fire based. So now we have a form of CC that's lightning based. The only consideration that I have for these the biggest problem is that they don't have a lot of HP. So each of these, like this max HP it's 126, but that's a charge, and these things hit fast. The reset timer on this one, 0.36 seconds. I mean, boom, boom, boom. That's each of those is a charge. These go down so quick. I hope that gets changed. I hope these become more useful, because I have high hopes for these in terms of being able to stop Sharkin. They can stop charging Sharkin, and if a Sharkin is poison immune, it's charging in, it's going to be immune to your gas trap. Well, this would be a nice solution for stopping poison immune Sharkin. I just haven't found a way to use them yet, but I'm hoping they become useful for that. Here is, of course, the size comparison. Interesting DU investment here. You can get one down for 2 DU, but this is 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They are pretty expensive if you start making them longer. 6 DU, not a very long beam here, long enough to be useful, but that's a pretty hefty investment. But yeah, there's the size comparison for the electric beams. So in terms of the beams, the buff beams here, you don't need to be right on top of it to still get the buff. So as you can see here, I'm going gradually farther and farther away from the beam, and this one's still getting buffed. It's not even really on top of it. The back's kind of not even hanging over. So you do have, it is pretty generous how far, or how close rather, you need to be to the beam. You don't need to be that close, but this one is buffed and this one's not. So, you got to consider the distance away from the beam when you're laying out your defenses. I think the most reliable way to tell if something is being buffed is not necessarily this animation. When you have a cluster of towers, it's not always obvious which one is being buffed and where the animation is and isn't. So in my opinion, probably the easiest way is to just look at the DPS, 54 here and 28.73 here. So obviously this one's being buffed and this one is not. It does show up the DPS in the tooltip if the tower is being buffed or not being buffed. So that's it for the Beamer EV. Heavily invest in power, in my opinion. That's going to be the way to go. Now, of course, I have a Waller EV. Pretty obvious what you do here. Heavily invest in Fortify. Now, I think maybe, unless things change, your Fortify Waller EV may also be the optimal EV to use for these shock beams, because if you have higher Fortify, these will have much higher max HP, 558 max HP compared to 273 from my beam EV. That's pretty significant. If the idea is to just keep these shock beams alive in the lane as long as possible, then it's probable that your Waller EV may also be your shock beam EV. But yeah, that's it for the Waller EV. It's just high Fortify is going to be the best thing for you. Obviously, you don't need attack or range or anything, or rate for walls, and I would say you don't want rate for shock beams either, because if they die quicker with rate being higher, that's no good. So yeah, just my thoughts on a Waller EV. Obviously, you want Fortify for that. I do have an EV set up for DPS. It has been lackluster for me. This beam has, the range isn't great. So, if this thing had infinite range, it would be really useful for chewing through like packs of copters, because it does pierce. It seems to pierce infinitely. Here you can see I'm shooting all 3 dummies. You know, it seems like this thing pierces infinitely for its range, but the range is just so short that it's tough to make it useful. I have a genie on here because you pop 1 shot after the MP is empty, and then you can go back. You can effectively have your beam up like 99% of the time. If you burn your whole MP bar down, you have a genie on you, you pop 1 shot, and then you're right back to full MP. So in theory, this could be good in some niche cases, but I don't have high hopes for a DPS EV. I haven't been impressed by her ability either, the decoy ability. What would have been great is if bosses went for this decoy, but they don't. The bosses ignore the decoys, so it's not useful for that. You can aggro ogres and things to it as well. Obviously, the other enemies will go after it, but bosses, they do not. A DPS EV not having a way to boost her damage or her run speed or anything kind of makes her a lackluster option for me. Why would I go with a DPS EV when I could use a Huntress or a Monk? I don't know yet. The verdict isn't in, but I don't have high hopes for a DPS EV. I spec'd mine all into attack like you would for any other DPS character, but I do have skill and boost on all of her and vitality on all of the gear on her as well, but I just don't know if I'm going to use a damage EV. That's going to do it for this video. I hope that was a good overview of the EVA. I'll have general changes to 1.1 for other characters and other things and stats and whatnot up in another video, but that's going to do it for me here now. Thank you so much for watching.